In January of 1897, Bradley and Cornelia Martin decided to host a ball. It was not unusual during America's Gilded Age for the wealthiest families in New York to host balls for the other wealthy families. However, details about this particular ball created a media frenzy that captured the imagination of the American public, making the Bradley Martin Ball one of the most notorious balls of the Gilded Age. My name is Megan Clevenger, public historian, coming to you from Brucemore, a National Trust site in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. If you love history, or even just like it a little, you're going to want to subscribe to our channel and ring that bell for notifications every time we upload new content. Before we dive into the actual Bradley Martin Ball, let's talk a little bit more about America in the late 19th century. Historians often refer to this period of American history as the Gilded Age. From about 1870 to 1900, the United States experienced unprecedented economic growth. Though the wealth from this growth was concentrated in just a handful of people, the name the Gilded Age suggests that this era shined with a thin veneer of gold for the wealthy, but in fact masked broader economic and societal issues for the lower and middle classes. Names that ring through American history, such as Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie, built their wealth during the Gilded Age, but it truly was just a small number who benefited from this economic boom. Millions of Americans upended their rural farm lives for the promise of greater economic opportunity in the big city. Countless immigrants from all over the world also came to American cities. They all clamored for jobs in steel factories and coal mines, hopeful for their chance to make their millions. However, during the Gilded Age, the gap between the haves and the have-nots only grew. 4,000 families held as much wealth as the next 12 million families combined. Several recessions didn't do anything to help the wealth gap either. And who do you think was most impacted by these recessions? If you said working-class people already struggling to provide for their families, you would be correct. For the wealthy of these industrial cities, especially those living in New York, the recessions were barely a concern. The elites of New York continued to host their balls, build their mansions, and flaunt their wealth. New York City was a microcosm of the wealth disparity during the Gilded Age. The city had long been the center of the United States economy, drawing the wealthy to build their factories and the workers to labor in them. Before the start of the Gilded Age, the wealthiest families in the city claimed they could trace their wealth and status all the way back to the Mayflower. As the economy started to take off in the 1870s, waves of families who recently made their fortune in booming industries such as steel production and coal mining moved to New York City, determined to enjoy the same lifestyle as the old money families. However, the old money families wanted little to do with the so-called nouveau riche and quickly tightened the edges around their lifestyle and society. By 1892, the Old Guard in New York produced a definitive list of 400 people who were deemed part of New York society. The 400, as the list was called, dictated who had access to this elite lifestyle. To be on the list was to have made it. This is the New York City that the Bradley Martins lived in when they decided to host a ball in the winter of 1897. It wasn't the first ball or formal event that the Bradley Martins hosted during their time as part of New York society, but it was certainly one of the most controversial and infamous balls of the Gilded Age. Bradley Martin and Cornelia Sherman met in 1869 at the wedding of a mutual friend. Bradley was a lawyer of comfortable means. Cornelia also enjoyed a comfortable life as her father made his living as a successful banker. During the early years of their marriage, they lived in New York City, and Mr. Martin began to prosper as a lawyer. The couple had 3 children together, Cornelia, Sherman, and Bradley Jr. When Mrs. Martin's father died in 1881, he left her a massive inheritance of $7 million, which is over $200 million today. With this newfound wealth, the Martin family swiftly stepped onto the New York society scene. They owned real estate in New York, Scotland, and England. They traveled between the continents regularly, though spent winters in New York to participate in the social season. Their daughter married the British Earl of Craven, successfully tying the Martins' American wealth to an aristocratic European family, which only boosted their notoriety in New York society. The Martins' wealth also connected them with movers and shakers in New York society, such as Anna Vanderbilt and Caroline Astor. Within the society, the Martins made a name for themselves, hosting lavish dinners and balls fit for their new station in life. When the 400 was published, the Martins made the list. While in New York in the winter of 1897, Cornelia Martin decided to host a fancy dress ball. According to many contemporary sources, Mrs. Martin's reasoning behind hosting her ball was charitable. Working-class New Yorkers were still feeling the effects of the 1893 recession, and Mrs. Martin was allegedly appalled by the evidence of hard times impacting the working people of the city. By sending out invitations to her ball only a few weeks before the date of the event, Mrs. Martin hoped her guests would choose New York-based dressmakers, tailors, milliners, wig makers, shoemakers, and other laborers to make their costumes, instead of ordering their costumes from overseas, which would stimulate the local economy with their wealth. Or perhaps Mrs. Martin just wanted to host the grandest ball the city had ever seen. Maybe both are true. In January 1897, Mrs. Martin sent approximately 1,200 invitations to her ball. Guests were invited to the famous Waldorf Hotel for the fete and were instructed to arrive in costumes reflecting the European courts of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. As was typical for society happenings at the time, New York-based newspapers published in their society pages who received invitations, who accepted their invitation, and what costumes guests intended to wear, and so forth. But on January 23rd, the New York Tribune published the words of a pastor speaking out against the Bradley Martin Ball, which skyrocketed public interest in the event. Reverend Dr. William Ransford used his pulpit to speak against the Bradley Martin Ball, saying that such an event would widen the breach between the rich and the poor. Because of the hardship facing so many New Yorkers, Reverend Dr. Ransford thought that it was not the right time for such a show of wealth and extravagance. In times like these, when misery is widespread and poverty is at the doors of so many, Ransford is quoted as saying, "Lavish expenditures of money on social forms of amusement are much out of place, for the reason that they draw attention to the growing gulf that separates the rich and the poor." Ransford went as far as to recommend that members of his congregation who were part of the 400 not attend the ball. With this seemingly small piece of news published on page 6 of the Saturday paper, interest in the Bradley Martin Ball snowballed. For the remaining weeks leading up to the ball, newspapers in New York and around the country filled their pages with details and gossip surrounding the ball. Hoping to capitalize on the popularity of the event, newspapers published messages from other pulpits speaking out against the ball, and letters to the editor from everyday people writing in support of the ball. Following a visit to a costumer's shop, Mr. Martin gave an interview which he alleged that the owner of the shop had to hire 180 additional seamstresses due to the orders received for the ball. The Bradley Martin Ball permeated pop culture so much at the time that a local pharmacy ran an ad boldly proclaiming, "If the Bradley Martin Ball helps the poor as swiftly and surely as Riker's expectorant cures a cough or cold, nobody will kick." And when Mrs. Martin finally announced her costume for her ball, the announcement made the front page of the New York Journal. By the time the Bradley Martin Ball occurred on February 10, 1897, the New York City public had been consumed by news of the ball every day for nearly 3 weeks. As guests of the Martins arrived to the fete, members of the public lined against the sidewalk of the Waldorf Hotel, trying to catch a glimpse of the attendees and their costumes. Guests didn't start arriving to the ball until well into the night. Gilded Age balls were famous for not starting until 10 or 11 p.m. and lasting all night long. It was considered another sign of wealth that the guests could dance well into the night, since they didn't have to wake up and go to work the next day. Invitees to the ball were dressed as all sorts of characters from European courts of old. Popular costume choices included Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette. Elaborate costumes were made from rich fabrics, and many included elaborate jewels. Mrs. Martin's costume of Mary, Queen of Scots, included a ruby necklace which belonged to Marie Antoinette. As promised from the pulpits and papers, the Bradley Martin Ball was an extraordinary display of wealth and luxury. The Martins thought of and paid for nearly everything. There were seamstresses, tailors, and wig makers on hand to help with costume malfunctions. Extra rooms in the Waldorf were rented for guests to use as changing rooms if their costumes were too elaborate to wear in a carriage. The Martins even paid for breakfast the following morning for guests who had danced the night away. As one would expect, the newspapers were full of details about the ball the day after. Depending on the paper, guest counts range from 600 to 1,100. Most papers agreed that the ball was a great success for the participants. There were, however, questions about whether the ball accomplished what it originally claimed to set out to do. provide jobs and money to working-class people in New York. Perhaps some businesses saw an increase in work, but did just one event really alleviate the hardships of thousands in the city? All told, the Bradley Martin Ball cost the Martins approximately $270,000 to host, which is the equivalent of over $10 million in 2024. How much of that money trickled down into the pockets of working people in New York City? It's truly impossible to say. Even though the Martin family hosted one of the most memorable balls of the Gilded Age, they did not reap the rewards of their success for very long. New York City authorities caught wind of how much the Martins spent to host their ball and decided if they could afford to put on an event that grand, perhaps they could afford to pay more on their property taxes. Following the ball, the assessed value of their New York home doubled, and so did their property taxes. In response, the Martins sold their property in New York and relocated permanently to their properties in Europe. The Martins felt that they were exiled for their efforts to help the working class in New York through the Bradley Martin Ball. The Bradley Martin Ball was one of the last great New York society balls of the Gilded Age and captured the imagination of the American public. With its hefty price tag and over-the-top opulence, the ball generated conversations around wealth inequality, how the wealthy spend their money, and if the wealthy have a responsibility to share their wealth with the public. It's been over 125 years since the Bradley Martin Ball, and conversations around wealth inequality are ongoing. Presently, economists and other experts question if we are in another Gilded Age. As of 2021, 2,750 people have more wealth than half the population of the planet. While the public consumed information about the Bradley Martin Ball in newspapers, today we now watch the wealthy on social media. We comment in real time on what celebrities, business people, reality TV stars, and influencers consume and how they spend their money. While high society events such as the Bradley Martin Ball may not be the norm in the 21st century, occasions such as the Met Gala, where unimaginable wealth is on display, make Dr. Reverend Rainford's comments from 1897 applicable a century later. Lavish expenditures of money on social forms of amusement continue to draw attention to the growing gulf that separates the rich and the poor. Thanks for watching this video about the Bradley Martin Ball. We will see you soon for the next Nooks and Crannies of History.